Today we are going to discuss downward attribution and filing of Form 5471. Let's say we have a foreign corporation that is 60% owned by a U.S. individual and 40% owned by a foreign individual. The individuals are not related to each other. The foreign corporation is more than 50% directly owned by a U.S. person. Therefore, the foreign corporation is a controlled foreign corporation, also known as a CFC. Because the U.S. individual owns at least 10% of the shares of the CFC, the U.S. individual is a U.S. shareholder and is a Category 5 filer for purposes of Form 5471. The U.S. individual in this case is also a Category 4 filer for purposes of Form 5471, but we are going to mostly focus on Category 5 filers in this video. Let's switch the percentages so that the foreign individual owns 60% and the U.S. individual owns 40%. In this case, the foreign corporation would not be a CFC, or at least it may not be a CFC. If the foreign individual happened to own 100% of the shares of a U.S. corporation, 60% of the shares of the foreign corporation would be attributed downward to the U.S. corporation. The U.S. corporation is considered a constructive U.S. shareholder. After applying this downward attribution, the foreign corporation would be 40% owned by the U.S. individual and 60% owned by the U.S. corporation. In other words, the foreign corporation would be considered 100% owned by U.S. persons, causing it to be a CFC. If the foreign corporation is a CFC, the U.S. individual must annually file Form 5471 as a Category 5 filer. It is therefore important for the U.S. individual to determine whether the foreign corporation is a CFC. However, the individual may not have and may not be able to get the information necessary to determine if the foreign corporation is a CFC. Revenue Procedure 2019-40 provides a safe harbor to determine if the foreign corporation is a CFC. The safe harbor does not apply if the CFC is a U.S.-controlled CFC. Here, the CFC is foreign-controlled because if you don't consider the downward attribution rules, the foreign corporation would not be a CFC. Under the safe harbor, as long as the U.S. person does not have actual knowledge that the foreign corporation is a CFC, and the U.S. person inquires of the foreign corporation whether it is a CFC, and the foreign corporation says it is not a CFC, then the U.S. person can assume it is not a CFC. Back to the constructive ownership structure for a minute. In this scenario, there are two U.S. shareholders of the CFC, the U.S. individual and the U.S. corporation. The U.S. individual would be considered unrelated to the foreign corporation because he or she does not directly, indirectly, or constructively own more than 50% of the shares of the foreign corporation. On the other hand, the U.S. corporation would be considered related to the foreign corporation because it constructively owns 60% of the shares of the foreign corporation. In summary, the U.S. individual is considered an unrelated Section 958A U.S. shareholder with respect to the foreign-controlled CFC. The U.S. corporation is a related constructive U.S. shareholder with respect to the foreign-controlled CFC. Revenue Procedure 2019-40 provides abbreviated Form 5471 filing requirements for both the U.S. individual and the U.S. corporation. If instead of the U.S. individual owning 40% of the shares, a foreign individual owned those shares, the foreign corporation would still be a CFC because 60% of the shares are still constructively owned by the U.S. corporation. However, Notice 2018-13 provides that if there are no direct or indirect U.S. shareholders of the CFC, then the constructive U.S. shareholder does not need to file Form 5471 as a Category 5 filer. Back to the structure with the U.S. individual owning 40% of the shares. If the foreign individual only owned 40% of the shares of the foreign corporation and an unrelated foreign person owned 20% of the shares of the foreign corporation, it would still be a CFC because 80% of the shares would be directly or constructively owned by U.S. persons. However, in this case, because the foreign individual does not own more than 50% of the shares of the foreign corporation, the U.S. corporation would not be considered related to the foreign corporation. Revenue Procedure 2019-40 provides that an unrelated, constructive U.S. shareholder of a CFC that is foreign-controlled is not required to file Form 5471 as a Category 5 filer. Therefore, in this circumstance, the U.S. corporation would not need to annually file Form 5471, but the U.S. individual would need to annually file Form 5471 as a Category 5 filer. And that is it. I hope this video has been helpful.